Hey team, hope you're well. Today I'm going to take you through a video going through everything you would need to consider if you're looking at making an offer on a property. The reason why I want to make this is because it's a very common question I get when I've given a client of mine the confidence that they can buy a property. Maybe their finance is already, approved, or they're basically in a position where they could buy a property, but they're wondering what that next step is in terms of like what things they need to consider and everything throughout the process of like making an offer and all those things. And I'm actually going to go through today everything that I'm going to be doing since I've recently had an offer accepted on another property. So I'm going to have the assumption that finance is already approved, and I'm going to go through basically everything I'm going to be taking off or considering before I've made an offer. In this situation, I already have made an offer and it's been accepted, but I want to take you through things you would, need to consider if you're looking at buying a property prior to that, maybe prior to having an offer accepted, just so you're setting yourself best up for that process. And then maybe if you've had an offer accepted, how to deal with that whole process as well. So it's going to be more so my perspective of how I personally do it, and some input that I would give to my clients basically is what this video is going to consist of. So again, like I said, I'm assuming finance is basically already approved for you. So if you're wondering if you can buy a property or not, that's probably the first thing you need to determine. So you can chat with a broker or potentially go directly to the bank, whatever one you feel more comfortable with. If that's something you want to find out, feel free to reach out to me and I can let you know what you could afford to buy if it's something you're interested in. So that's the first step to take off. And I'm assuming in this video that you've already achieved that. The next thing to consider is before making an offer on a property. Okay, so for the example I'm going to share in this video, I've recently had a property accepted in Rotorua for $330,000 that I'm looking at. So before I made this offer, these were the things I was, quickly considering in terms of if it was worthwhile me making an offer. Okay, so the first one is protecting myself. So I want to make sure that if I make an offer on this property and during my further due diligence, the more that I look into it, I want to have a way where I can pull out of the agreement if I would like to without, any big ramifications on mine, like any high costs or anything like that. So for any of my clients, I always say, look, something to look into is to protecting yourself. So you have that gateway of pulling out an agreement if you don't want to proceed for whatever reason or something happens, okay? So the other thing to consider is how to go about making the offer. So there's a few different ways you can make an offer. If you're going to protect yourself when making an offer, you'll need to make what's called a conditional offer. So you can say things along the lines of, you might only make an offer on the property if you can guarantee that you have an arrangement or dedicated time to arrange finance. Maybe it's to have a satisfactory building report, a land and information memorandum, which basically identifies like the geography of the property and where it's on the section if there are any concerns and that. Maybe if it's in a flood zone, for example, maybe a methamphetamine report. Maybe there's a dedicated time to arrange a report on that and to see if anything comes back on that. So in terms of making an offer, this can be done, I guess, verbally. Obviously, if you make a verbal offer, it's not, in writing, but you can do it on what's called a sale and purchase agreement. So for this property, basically what I said is like, look, I've done enough due diligence. I want to protect myself. I want to make an offer at $330,000 and prepared based on the numbers I've done that's a level I want to make an offer at. Can I please sign a sale and purchase agreement and give myself enough time to complete these conditions? So that's how I did it. Now, in some occasions, if you're looking to buy a property, you might have to be prepared to make what's called an unconditional offer, where you can't have these conditions. This is what happens in auction. So anytime you have experienced or seen an auction take place in New Zealand, at least, those bids that are happening, they're actually unconditional offers. They're not conditional offers. So before time, it's your responsibility to get in a position where you're unconditional. If you proceed with making an unconditional offer, you're legally required to go through with the purchase if your offer is accepted. So there's a lot more ramifications. You can't necessarily protect yourself, like I've said here. So these are just, things to consider, right? I'm just, trying to identify these things. So for you guys. Now, due diligence is another thing that I highly recommend my clients at least to consider when making an offer, because this clause or this type of condition in an offer basically gives you any reason to pull out of a contract for whatever reason at your own discretion. So basically for this property, I actually have made a conditional offer subject to a due diligence clause. So it's basically within 7 working days, I can say I can pull out of the agreement for whatever reason. Even if I obtain finance, even if I get a building report that's satisfactory, I still actually have the option to pull out of the agreement if I wish to. So I've made that's something that just gives me a little bit more flexibility. If needed or required, or if something happens in my situation, that's an external factor outside of those like traditional conditions like finance or a building report, I can still pull out of the agreement at my own discretion. The other thing is as well is if you're considering making an offer, especially a written offer on a sale and purchase agreement, you will need a lawyer. I guess for another party to accept any offer, they're probably not going to consider an offer on a sale and purchase agreement without a lawyer, because any property transaction that takes place in New Zealand, the seller of the property and the purchaser of the property both need to have lawyers, and if you don't have a lawyer representing you, they're probably not going to consider this like an official offer, so to speak. So having a lawyer or a property lawyer represent you and sorting that ahead of time prior to you actually making an offer is another thing you need to consider and think about. It doesn't necessarily have to be one local to you, but ideally you can have someone you feel like is going to represent you really well, maybe help you identify risks or other things to consider from a legal point of view, because in the sale and purchase agreement for any property, there could be additional things you need to consider, or maybe things that are removed or not included, and just other things to think about, right? So this is another thing to make sure you have sorted before making an offer on a property as well. But all of these things, like for this property I was looking at, I've made multiple offers on properties over the last 2 years. So I'm personally very prepared for this. But these are all things I pass on to my clients and say, look, you need to consider these even before making an offer. Making sure you're basically protecting yourself. You run your numbers. Like I obviously thought to myself, for this deal, with the level I'm buying it at relative to how the bank valuations are valuing the property and the rental income this property would achieve, I'm happy to offer 330, and that's why I made the offer at that level. If you want to actually look at maybe my analysis videos of how I determine if a property is good value or makes sense, you can probably go through my channel and find those videos. Now, the other thing that personally I will do when I've had an offer accepted like I've had is now I actually will dedicate more time to the due diligence. So, for example, say I made an offer of $330,000 and this offer wasn't accepted, and I had taken the time to contact all of these people, and then someone else down the road locally in Rotorua might have made an offer at $350K. They took that offer. I would have wasted all of my time partaking in doing these activities now, but now I've had the offer accepted and I have 7 working days basically to get my ducks in a row. And if I want to unconditionally proceed with this, I have to tick these boxes off. But I'm only doing these now because I've had the offer accepted and I know I can proceed with buying the property at $330K if I'm happy with these things. So this is an important distinction, is that you don't necessarily have to do all of the work up front before making an offer. Now, because it's been accepted and I know I can proceed at $330K for the next 7 days, it's worth me maybe looking at these things during this period. So something on my to-do list is, because this will be a rental property, I'm going to be calling some local property managers in the area. I probably will call 2 to 3. I might ask the real estate agent for some referrals of people that could be good candidates, because they obviously know the area quite well, and I'm not so exposed to the Rotorua area. I'm from Wellington originally. I've been in Auckland for 2 years. Haven't spent so much time in Rotorua. I've been on the luge a couple of times and on the Zorb and things like that. But I don't really have a great understanding of what realistically this place could rent for. I obviously follow markets and regions all around New Zealand for what is of good value relative to the last 2 months of me searching for 3 bedrooms and all of these things. I've got a good understanding of that. I feel like I have a gauge of what it could probably rent for, but I want a realistic appraisal and feedback from local property managers that would be renting this property for me remotely and representing me. So I probably would call 2 to 3 of them. That would probably be what I would try to do, just to get pricing, get a bit of feedback for who I think would be best representing me in that regard. So that's important, and that's probably not going to take so long for me to identify, but it's something I definitely would need to do, and it's probably going to take me 30 minutes to an hour to complete, so probably not too long. Now the other big thing is, now I need to really identify the other big risks. If I proceed with buying this property at $330K, what are the worst case scenarios that can happen? So one thing to probably get an understanding of the structure of the building and having a building report completed. That's probably the area where there's the highest concern of something maybe going wrong with this purchase, right? If the property isn't structurally sound and there's going to be a lot of remedial work for me to rectify the property, and be a concern. Another one is probably insurance that comes to mind as well. So if the property is uninsurable for whatever reason, it means that a bank actually won't give finance for the property. Say for example, if I'm buying this property for $330,000, and let's say the loan I'm getting on this property might be $280,000. In the event, there's a fire, now the property's value might go from being $330K to the land value, which might be, say, who knows, maybe $170K. My loan would remain the same, but because there's no, claim that can be made against the property for the fire that's happened or transpired, my debt would remain the same, but the bank's security would be less than the debt. So now the bank would be very vulnerable. So pretty much they want to ensure from the bank's point of view that insurance can be obtained on the property, or they won't actually give you the finance for it if there's no, insurance. So that's another thing that's really, really important to get ahead of time, because you don't want to be in a position where you go unconditional, where you legally have to proceed, but insurance hasn't been arranged on the property with full exclusions for everything, So that's a huge thing to get sussed, and that's a big risk to identify. For this specific property that I'm buying, it's pretty minimal in terms of probably other risks that could incur. I think remedial work and insurance are probably the two big things that immediately come to mind. But for any property, it's just really identifying those worst case scenarios if you're buying. And that's something I would identify during this process once I've had an offer accepted like I have, and going deeper into that. I'm also going to ask, we'll talk about sort of AI and how it can actually be really, really helpful. And I'll give some input on terms of like things I will use with AI when identifying other things with the property shortly. But the other thing I will look further into, because I did initially look a little bit for this property in regards to, things like spreadsheets, capital growth, and cash flow before making an offer, but I will dive a little bit deeper. So I've actually got two spreadsheets. One primary one that I use to identify cash flow for a certain property. So this is another example of another property that I was looking at earlier. And for this, say, I'll input the purchase price, what my future debt position would be, what my future interest rate will be, all of these things from a cash flow point of view. So this is a good cash flow calculator I use, and I probably would run through all of the numbers in detail to determine if it's pretty good, especially relative to maybe other properties within that certain area. With Rotorua being, I guess, a bigger city, probably top 10 in terms of population size in New Zealand, maybe the yield would be a little bit lower compared to, say, smaller towns, like your towns in the central North Island, maybe your Tukuroas, Tikuitis, Taumaranui, maybe like your Harwooders in the New Plymouth area, or possibly your Ashburdens, Timaroos, like the yield might be, say, a little bit lower compared to them, but it's obviously a little bit higher than, say, your Aucklands, your Wellingtons, in those areas. So, I would probably think like maybe try identify other properties within a similar price bracket, what yield I could actually get to determine if that's actually good value from a cash flow point of view, and those sort of things I would be considering. And then I would maybe look at other things regarding how many listings there are in Rotorua, based on the population of Rotorua to listings, and compare that to other areas, maybe like your Gisbornes, your Tauranga, your Hamiltons, and see if maybe there's like I guess inverse or ratio that's quite small relative to other areas in terms of maybe like, is there not so much supply relative to demand and all those things from a capital growth point of view. Those are like other things I probably would be looking at. But there's so many things to consider, but primarily I would look at data and spreadsheets to determine, the capital growth upside or potential from like a bear and bull case point of view in a little bit more detail right now that I've secured the property and if it actually makes sense. The other thing too, which I just mentioned before, if I go back here, is getting AI to help me with this. So, I'm probably pretty limited with, my capability with my brain power, but now with AI, because of all the data it has now, it can be so helpful for actually those sort of questions I just asked. And I can run, deeper analyses, both for the spreadsheets and questions I was just saying before, and also the risks too. So any documents, I can upload and maybe help identify risks maybe that I wouldn't consider, and also it helps to have AI, not only for me personally, but for clients to use this, because a lot of times clients will come to me and they'll ask questions that probably could have just been answered really well with AI. Obviously, with myself, I like to think within the mortgage industry, I can identify and problem solve maybe a little bit better than AI in a lot of scenarios, but it can be really helpful for these things specifically, like any big risks to consider, and it's very transparently laid out in terms of the output you get from AI. It's really, really helpful just for these things specifically, I find. So I'm not afraid to admit to say like AI can be really, really helpful in these scenarios, because it really, really can be. And primarily, yet these are the things that I would be considering. There's probably other questions I would personally have for this property too that will come up, but primarily I think these are all the things I would consider to determine if it's actually a good property purchase or not. Another thing I personally will really try to look at is determine what the bank is valuing the properties for. This can be important as well, and I'll go through with clients what this means for them moving forward as well. So, for example, say if I buy this property for $330,000, but the bank valuation is actually $400K, and the loan I take out on this property is $280,000. That would actually be 70% of the value of $400,000 exactly. But say if the bank valuation was $450,000 and the debt against this property is $280,000, that actually means I could have the possibility to also borrow up to another $35,000 against this property, as long as I can prove I can service this $315,000, which is 70% of $450,000. So assessing and determining the bank valuation is actually quite important, because this could be useful to have in the event, say I find another property opportunity and I want to release equity to be able to buy that and maybe use this as a deposit for another property. So personally, that's something quite important to me, and I think about quite a lot. But yeah, that's just an example of maybe like an additional thing I would do on top of like this primary stuff, or the fundamentals of things to consider when buying a property. But yeah, I think that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today, guys. So hopefully you got some input out of that. If you do want to have a call with me, maybe we can go through on a video call, all of these things to consider if you're looking at buying a property, or maybe if you haven't actually got finance approved, or isn't, it's something you need to see if it's, has a high probability of being approved. If you're looking to buy a property, I can run through that and all of this stuff on a call with you if that's something you're interested in. I'll leave my form in the description that you can complete if you want to, have that sort of conversation. And if you don't want to have that conversation just yet, maybe if you want to learn, gather a little bit more information, I'll leave some other videos on the screen that you could watch that could be helpful. Cheers.